Well, I hope everyone had a good week one in looking at materials and providing comments. I did want to thank everyone for their information in Blackboard, both on some background information about yourselves, but also in response to the specific question that was posted regarding the clinical trial in the Netherlands. We're going to go through this section today to take a look at what is a good research question, kind of the criteria that are needed to really review this. And there's a number of criteria that you'll see in a number of areas in readings and online, which we'll go through, and then some additional ones that I feel are very important to look at. So to begin with, we have something that's feasible. And this makes sense that we don't want to try to do something that we cannot really accomplish or really be able to have an end result for. So we take a look at the number of subjects that are going to be required for the study. And again, this will differ depending on what phase of the clinical trial that we are in. And technical expertise can run the gambit of different areas. So technical expertise can be for project management or data management. It can be the clinical side, the legal side. There's a whole variety of areas where you need expertise to be able to do this. And part of that initial research question should take into consideration the availability of that expertise. Affordability is another area, time and money. And we can look at this in different ways, and just understanding the further you go in the phases from phase 1 moving forward, 2, 3, 4, the further you go, the more time and money are needed. So in the very early stages of setting up a research question, we want to take a look at a timeline of what we think is manageable, what the scope is, and how much financial backing will be needed. So these are all items that make a good research question feasible. Now, added to that is something if it's interesting or not. And interesting within the realm of clinical research is really, do the investigators, do the colleagues and sponsors and even patients actually have an interest in the area? We want to have this in such a way that people are actually trying to find information and be able to leverage that information in patient care. And so when we look at this from a standpoint of human subjects, we want people who are interested to make sure everything is done in the appropriate way, but also that they have an interest in finding the outcome for the betterment of whatever that specific treatment may be. Some people feel that it's also very important to be novel. And novel can have a couple areas. It can be a new area, something that's never been researched before, or it can be a previous area where we're going to confirm the results, perhaps refute the results, or extend the results. I think many of you can understand the confirmation that we have a study, we have a specific product that's in the marketplace, we have another product that's coming out, and we're going to confirm that this does work in this specific therapeutic area and move forward from there. Or something that may refute, that may say, no, this is not correct. We've done our study, and this is how we're going to look at it from that standpoint. In clinical research, the extent is an interesting aspect. And hopefully many of you are familiar enough with the idea of medications that have been brought to the market. And while they have gone through all the phases and have been approved by the FDA, they then find that there's another purpose that can be used, another therapeutic area that may be of benefit. So I always like to give a couple examples here. One is in the area of mental health, where we found a product that was used for depression, and then finding that a number of the patients at the same time were able to quit smoking, and found out that there's a component of this medication that actually can be used for smoking cessation as well. Another example is a medication that was used for hypertension that had the, in a sense, side effect of hair growth, which then they were able to use the product in a different perspective and be able to use it in that aspect as well. So we can see how these things can be different from those perspectives. We definitely want the research question to have an ethical component, looking at it from an IRB standpoint or looking at it to protection of human subject volunteers. And with the understanding that the information that hopefully you read in week 1 in the resource section, looking at the 3 different types of documents, for lack of a better term, that are available, and those that provide us criteria and guidelines on how we work with human subjects, be it either the Belmont Report or Helsinki from that standpoint, or Nuremberg, any of those, from that standpoint. But the question is, can it be controversial? And in my, perspective, yes, we could get into some research questions that may be controversial and still be ethical. So we'll talk about some of those later when we talk about cases and items that we look through from a standpoint of clinical research. And is it relevant, and specifically relevant to the scientific knowledge? As I mentioned before, we can talk about clinical or legal or other aspects, but what about policy and public health? Are there other areas that are important for us from a scientific knowledge standpoint? And is it important and relevant to future research, especially from an ethical impact? We are well aware of research that has gone on in the past where there's been concerns of how things were done. But again, as I mentioned with the information I posted on Blackboard for the Netherlands, we still have ethical concerns of when and how different types of research are actually moved forward, and when you make the decision to end or stop a given project. And the question is, are there others we can take a look at? And these are some that I find are worthwhile to at least explore. Is it challenging? We've had a lot of Me Too, so to speak, research where different organizations will take a look at being able to do something very similar to others. And that's why when we use the other information of looking at something that may be novel or different from that standpoint. And does it have to be contemporary? And again, from my personal perspective, it can be either way. Does it have to have a distinctive approach to older issues? And my comment is no, because there are some very solid methodologies that have been used in the past that we can still use today, but there are new approaches that we have seen that have been very beneficial and very helpful. And connecting the dots is very important. This is looking at trends and patterns, and this is one of the aspects in the Netherlands case where a couple of you asked, how long did this go before they could make their decision to stop and take a look at what was happening? So yeah, the idea behind this is a good research question should be able to track the trends and the patterns that they're seeing as the research is moving forward to see what happens. The problem you have in clinical trials is that you have multiple points that are moving forward at the same time, and it takes time to get the trend analysis. So we have to have that expertise that can look at this rather quickly from that standpoint. And lastly, of course, is this actually researchable? Is this something that we can actually find an answer to from that perspective? So I'd like to provide you with 4 or 5 kind of fun questions that you can think of yourself and make some decisions of how you look at this. And one of them is there a link between television watching and violence? Is this easily researchable or not easily researchable? Again, I'll make you, I shouldn't say make you, I'll have you make the decision of how you look at this individually, but let me give you some examples. It really depends on the research question itself. If you look at this as a yes, no, then I guess it could be researchable. But the question is, are we going to take a look at anything outside of this, any other environmental factor that may impact, which makes this not easily researchable because of the number of other factors that may be involved. So again, it just depends on how you read different questions and how you look through them. Does Coke or Pepsi make a better beverage? And again, some people will say this is absolutely researchable because we can take a blinded test and have someone drink a Coke or drink Pepsi and say which one is better. At the same time, you could say it's not fully researchable because how do you define the word better? Is it a better beverage? Are we talking about taste? Are we talking about other aspects of the beverage? So the question may not be specific enough to be able to highlight what we initially wanted to look for. If I asked you what are the current marketing strategies for the BS clnr program, So the program that's prior to this, not the master's, but the BS, would you say that that question is okay, too broad, or too narrow? Something you can think about from that standpoint. And then I would also say, what is the importance of clinical research in our lives? Is that a question that's too broad, too narrow, or okay? And so this is really highlighted more from what you would be looking at in that aspect. I could very easily ask you what are the marketing items for the master's program, but I wanted to use a different program from the aspect of saying a program that some of you have been in, a couple of you, but some have not. So an actual way to answer the question, you'd have to do some research to find out about that. If a research question is, what are the basic principles of the Belmont Report? Well, as a research question, I'm not sure that it's really solid. As a question to ask for information, I think it makes a lot of sense. And we could use this again for Nuremberg or Helsinki as well. So it really looks at these different aspects of how we'd like to really follow through on this. There are questions that are too broad, and there are questions that are too narrow. If I were to ask you, how many clinical trials have been completed in 2017? Is that an okay research question, too broad or too narrow? Again, I'll let you decide on that, but think through the idea of why it could be too broad, and in fact, could it be too narrow as well? So there's different ways of looking at questions and how we go through them. How do parents of children with addictions most positively interact with their children? Now, I find this to be very interesting. And as you heard that and read that, I would have you ask yourself, what was your first reaction to this question? Is this an okay research question? Is it too broad or too narrow? Now, I will make the assumption, because I've used this question in class a number of times over the years, that the majority of you thought of this as parents of children with addiction as being a child who's young. But in fact, what do you do with parents who are in their 60s, who have children perhaps in their 30s, who are addicts? Does that change your perspective of the research question? Does it change how you look at it from that perspective? So again, a research question by itself is fine when you read it based on the assumptions that you have, but depending on how we look at this, if I said I want to look at all parents, regardless of age, of children with addicts, and how do they most positively interact with their children, that's a very broad question. If I ask how do parents of children ages 5 through 15 with addictions most positively interact with their children, I've begun to narrow it down. So there are ways to look at these questions to see how they differ and where we may go from that standpoint. Thank you, and I hope this will stir some ideas for you in looking at the overall process of questions for research.